Welcome to our show, Holding Ground. My name is Laura Richer. I'm a psychotherapist and the owner of Anchor Light Therapy Collective in Seattle, Washington. Each week, I'm joined by another therapist from the Anchor Light team to tackle important topics in mental health and psychotherapy. Our goal is to promote well-being by normalizing mental health challenges. We are here holding ground for you every Tuesday morning at 9:30 a.m. on KKNW. Good morning. Welcome to Holding Ground, the show that gives you a little bit of everything in the realm of psychotherapy and positive mental health. I am your host, Laura Richer. I'm a licensed psychotherapist, and I'm the owner of Anchor Light Therapy Collective in Seattle, Washington. And today I am joined by my lovely co-host, Michelle Mooney. Good morning, Michelle.
Good morning, Laura, and thanks to all of our listeners for tuning in this morning. How are you doing today?
I am doing great. And Michelle is our clinical director at our Queen Anne offices. And today we have a great topic. Michelle, tell our listeners what we're going to be talking about today.
Our topic for today is if it's healthy to fight with your partner.
And this is a great topic. We talk to couples about this in couples therapy all the time. People wonder if they're normal, if they are fighting with their partners. And what do you think about that, Michelle? Is it normal to have conflict in a relationship?
It really comes down to how you do it. So couples, all couples are going to disagree. And typically unhealthy couples tend to be the ones who really fight, but we're always going to disagree. In fact, there's a stat from the Gottmans that about 69% of all disagreements between couples are unresolvable. Mm-hmm. So there's just things that you're always going to differ on, whether that's how you use social media, right? One couple posts all the time, the other couple, other person never does. Yeah. Things even like leaving the cabinets open, to what temperature do we keep the thermostat at, things like that. So we're always going to have disagreements, but it's how we communicate when we're doing that.
Exactly. So, the question, is it normal to fight? I guess it depends on how you define fighting. If you're screaming and throwing things at each other, that's definitely occurs. However, it isn't healthy or effective communication. But like you said, everybody's going to have disagreements. You have two people, two different opinions, two different way of thinking, and we're not always going to be able to be on the same page. In fact, like you said, according to the Gottmans, more times than not, we're not going to be on the same page. But there are healthy ways to talk about that. So what does it look like to have healthy conflict in a relationship?
I think the main thing it comes down to is respect and how much we respect our partner when we are actually disagreeing. So are you accepting your partner's point of view? It's not that you have to say, yes, I absolutely agree with that. That's how I think about it too. But are you willing to entertain the thought that they might have a different perspective? Because it really does always come down to that. When we are having conflict with one another, there's no facts, there's just perspective, right, Laura? So it's how each individual experiences the situation. That's their truth. And so we have to be able to communicate that to one another. This is actually how I saw it, but I could see that you saw it that way. Just these little semantic things where you're really acknowledging your partner and then working towards a solution together. So it's us versus the problem versus me, instead of me versus you.
Yes. And that's a very important piece of the puzzle. When you can address the issue as a problem that the two of you are trying to come to some sort of maybe compromise on versus battling each other, it gets much, from that perspective, from that mindset, it's much easier to solve the problem. And then you also, another thing that can be really hard for people when they're feeling triggered and like conflict is starting to escalate up is you don't have to agree with your partner to de-escalate a conflict. There doesn't have to be, you could have a completely different perspective, like you said, but if you can really validate that you understand their perspective, that is a great way to have healthy conflict. Yeah, we don't see this in the same way, but I understand that you have a different point of view, you have a different life experience, you have different concerns than I do. And that right there, validating, it's really hard for couples to do, but it's so incredibly key because it really can help de-escalate the situation. Do you see that in couples therapy? Couples who validate each other have less conflict?
Yes, I do. And those who, sit on my couch here in this room, or I see on the Zoom screen that do, they tend to really, for lack of a better term, you can tell that they like each other more. They have a stronger bond, even if they're in couples therapy. I always reflect to couples when they have really good ways of accepting influence and entertaining the thought that, their partner has a good point, and they validate that. I mean, it's so wonderful to see couples embrace that skill, because it really does bode well for the relationship overall. And another thing I like to remind couples about is, when we're in the heat of conflict, we can assume things, and I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit more. But as opposed to just deciding, hey, this is what my partner means, now I'm furious, be curious, right? Ask clarifying questions. This is how this sounded to me. Is that how you intended it? Versus, well, Laura said this and it must mean this, and now I'm going to act out as if that's true. So ask questions.
And we start to hear the things that we're thinking. I had a couple I was working with one time that was they were having a conflict about family coming to visit. And the one of the partners had said, well, I just have some concerns about your mother staying here because of what happened, what transpired last time, or whatever the situation was. And the other person said, well, this is because you hate my mother. And then we said, okay, let's slow this down. What are you hearing her say? And she's like, well, she said she hates my mother. And the person was not trying to gaslight. They heard what they were expecting their partner to say. So it's very interesting. Sometimes we just even hear things that aren't actually said because we're filling in the narrative. We're feeling escalated. We feel maybe threatened, and we're not creating space to really listen to our partner's concerns or validate. We're going to that conclusion. Have you ever witnessed anything like that?
Yes, absolutely. And I kind of what this comes down to is a little bit of confirmation bias in a way. So, for example, Laura, if you have been late 3 times to showing up for a date or whatever it might be over the course of our relationship, and I find that highly disrespectful behavior, to the point where I feel like, gosh, if Laura really loved me, she would never do this to me. So, and then the thing happens. And then we're always looking for evidence that thought is actually true. Well, they're going to be late and it's because they don't love me. So we reinforce those things. We kind of discard all of the times, right? Out of 500 times you were late 3 times. So what about the 497 other times? No. There was just these 3 times. So we can tend to discard anything that might be evidence that thought or narrative isn't actually true.
Yes. And so that takes us into our next topic here. What does it look like when conflict becomes abusive or toxic or really damaging to the relationship? And of course, the Gottmans talk a lot about that, the 4 horsemen. What are the 4 horsemen that people want to watch out for in their communication?
So we have stonewalling, we have criticism, we have contempt, and then we have defensiveness. Really thinking about these, probably every couple has at least tipped their toe in the water with some of these ways of having conflict. And, it comes down to, let's say, defensiveness. If your reaction, if I come to you and I say, I can't believe you stole the remote all night long and you wouldn't give me a chance to pick what I wanted to watch on TV. And the other partner says, well, last night you had it all to yourself. Oh, okay. Well, let's talk about what we should be talking about. And that's compromise over the remote versus you versus me. But if you come at me and say, well, you, Michelle, then our immediate reaction is to defend ourselves. Well, an arrow was just thrown at me. How do I throw one back? And typically it's not. That never goes well.
Yes. So you're getting to, in the very least, ineffective communication if you're approaching your concerns with a tone of criticism or even contempt. So in that's a great example. Like, you're hogging the remote. You never let me watch my shows. Well, that's going to be perceived as critical, and it's going to be harder for your partner to hear your concerns, because you're insinuating that they have some sort of negative intention. And if they don't feel that they have a negative intention, they're going to be on guard to defend themselves. So you can certainly, you want to discuss your concerns. However, if you approach them from my experience instead of you did this place, it's going to usually be received a lot better. So, I feel like we watched your show the last 2 nights. I would really like to watch one of my shows tonight. Would that work for you? Is going to be received a lot better than you just are trying to hog the TV.
Right. Yeah, if I come home from work and I say, Laura, the kitchen is such a mess, you're a slob, right? That's criticism. And trying to remind yourself, okay, I'm criticizing this behavior. Well, if we're criticizing somebody, what we're trying to communicate is, hey, I wish your behavior was a little bit different. I have a wish here. So that's probably not a good way of getting at, I feel frustrated when the dishes are left out, right? Can you please chip in and do these tonight and help me out? So that's what you really want. But for some reason, we just automatically can go to criticism and point out the negative versus asking for the positive. So keeping that in mind.
Yeah. And then defensiveness, even if your partner has come to you with a critical comment, it makes it harder to respond. But defensiveness can be really toxic in relationships because it basically shuts down the conversation. Well, you're hugging the remote. Well, you're just always mad about something. So what I've basically said to my partner in this defensive response, I haven't acknowledged their concern. And maybe it's hard to do that because it felt critical. But also you're just shutting down the conversation. And what you're basically saying is, I am unwilling to discuss your needs. I am unwilling to hear what you're upset about. And in doing that, a lot of times people just kind of shut down. There comes in the stonewalling, the conversation isn't had. And over time, that feels very destructive because defensive responses are constantly telling your partner, I'm not going to meet your needs. I'm not going to hear what you have to say.
Right. It's making excuses. Well, this is why I did this, or shifting blame over to your partner. Right. And the antidote to this is taking a little bit responsibility for your own behavior. So even if, right, maybe one partner might be, we're never right or wrong, but if one partner might have, let's say, a stronger point in a particular instance, that doesn't mean the other one doesn't, right? So if I could be defensive, maybe the responsibility piece I take in there is, you know what, you're right, I shouldn't have at least raised my voice then, right, when you were trying to communicate. So there's some element of probably how you helped derail the conflict as well.
Yes. Yeah. And, no one is perfect. People are going to have strong emotions and they're going to react to those emotions at times. And so we don't want to police each other, but we like to think about, one of my couples said to me one time, they're like, well, I guess just when there's an argument, somebody just has to suck it up and just figure out, how to de-escalate the situation. And actually I was like, yes, that is true. If you notice that your partner is becoming dysregulated and upset, and you have the wherewithal to see that and the skills to de-escalate it, it's great to say, you know what, I see what I said just upset you. I maybe I was a little harsh in the way I said that. Like, let's bring this conversation back to a place where we can discuss things. Being able to own your part, being able to recognize what is happening, maybe when your partner can't, it's not, like you said, it's not you against your partner, it's you against the problem. And so that's just you recognizing, oh, the problem is taking over. Let me get me and my partner back on the same page here.
Yeah, if you imagine, if you and your partner are sitting on the couch together and you're trying to have some sort of conflict, a healthy disagreement conversation, imagine whatever the problem is. So you're sitting next to your partner, is this wall between the two of you, because it's getting in the way of you two connecting. So if we could pick that wall up and put it on the coffee table in front of us and both look at it and say, how are we going to tackle this versus letting this thing come in between us? So, thinking about it from that point. So we talked a little about criticism. So the blaming, maybe some more hurtful expressions of judgment or disapproval, but contempt, Laura, tends to be the greatest predictor of a relationship not working out. And that is showing anger, disgust, even hostility towards your partner. So using insults, really attacking their character and their personality versus like, I'm really frustrated about this behavior you're slap, right? Versus really attacking the character, acting superior, mocking, sometimes even sarcastic tone, eye rolling. So this is very dangerous behavior. We did have a show last week about gaslighting, and this is kind of close to that. So what are some ways that couples can correct contemptuous behavior, Laura?
I think just being mindful of doing anything that places you in a position where you're taking the stance of having superiority over your partner and you're trying to use shame to correct their behavior. So if you're rolling your eyes, if you're doing an exasperated sigh, if you're even being, overly sarcastic or mocking, using a mocking tone, what you're essentially saying is I have like a hostile disregard for you because you're ridiculous. So that can be very painful for someone who maybe what they're doing is trying to get your attention in some sort of way. You can certainly talk about your experience again instead of rolling your eyes saying, hey, I'm getting really frustrated right now, or letting out an exasperated sigh. Maybe I just need a break from this conversation right now. So doing some things to express your experience that aren't harmful and aren't positioning yourself as being superior as your partner. Do you have any other anecdotes for that, Michelle?
Yeah, so a long-term one is really trying to get into the practice of remembering things that you love about your partner, the things that, giving them compliments, reminding yourself and them of what you notice their strengths are, showing more affection. Because if we have a more positive attitude about our partner overall, we're less likely to really be this mean to them with this contemptuous behavior. So really trying to switch that narrative, because again, the confirmation bias, if I have a lot of contempt for you, you better believe I'm looking for all the ways that you're messing up and not all the ways that you're doing things right.
Yeah. And another anecdote for all of these negative types of communication behavior is really focusing on staying connected to each other. So having moments of connection that feel positive throughout the day. If you don't talk to someone all day and maybe you've had a negative interaction with them and then you're not touching base, it's going to be very easy to create a negative narrative in your mind about what they're doing, what they're thinking, what their feelings towards you are. And then you're going to start reacting to that narrative, which is something really that's just been made up versus what is actually happening. So if you have those points of connection throughout your week, throughout your day, you're really like hearing each other, listening to each other. It's easy. It's harder to start imagining these negative narratives.
Right. Exactly. Because you're thinking about all the evidence against that actually being true. So the other one that really can derail conflict is the concept of stonewalling. So what that really is emotionally withdrawing, sometimes physically withdrawing, leaving the room, kind of shutting down and just becoming silent, no longer engaging with your partner or the discussion, which can have its benefits if we do that right. So what would be a good way of, kind of coming to your limits, shutting down the conversation a little bit, so to speak, and in a healthy way, Laura?
Yes. So there is a time, it is absolutely valid that we need breaks. We become flooded, we become overwhelmed. We can't have logical, rational conversations when we're feeling emotionally escalated and overwhelmed. So it's valid to take a break. The way that you don't want to do this is to just shut down and give someone the silent treatment. Or when they ask you what's wrong, say, I'm fine. When clearly your body language and your energy is showing that you are not, because that's punitive. What you're doing is you're saying, I've now withdrawn from you and I'm abandoning you, is how that's perceived. The positive way to do that, which is very fair and not always easy, is to say, again, always speaking from your own experience, I'm feeling overwhelmed right now. I need a break from this conversation, but I understand it's important and I'm going to come back to you. And if you can't even give a time frame and say, I'm going to just take a walk around the block. Let's reconvene in 20 minutes, or I need a couple hours. We'll talk about this tonight. But you want to really let your partner know you're not abandoning them. You're not punishing them. You're just taking a break for yourself so that you can have a productive conversation.
Right, right. Because if you are stonewalling, sometimes the function is, okay, maybe if I shut this down, we can avoid the discussion altogether. But really, what comes out of that is underlying problems go unresolved and they
Yeah.
stack up underneath the rug. And so, when what this does to your partner, you're using that word abandon. Absolutely. Well, they abandoned me, they abandoned this conversation.
Mhm.
So, often what that does is then inspires the other person to become the pursuer. Where'd you go? Are you done yet? You can't just shut this down. So, it's not actually probably going to go the way that you're hoping for. Instead of, if you let your partner know you need a break, we need to respect that when our partner is doing it. One thing I caution sometimes couples, if I see them doing it too much, well, you told me to use a break. So I just use a break every time we have a conversation. I've seen that before. I'm like, okay, cool, you're practicing that. And maybe, we need to move away from the extreme side of that, because otherwise you're just using that as a weapon. And hey, the couples therapist told us to do this. So
Yes. And we don't want it to be punitive or to be a weapon. And again, that's why, and I always tell my couples too, if you call a break, do not make your partner pursue you to continue the conversation. If you call a break,
Mhm.
it is your job, once you've calmed yourself, to go back to the conversation. You can't wait for them to pick it back up again. Because what happens in that process, when somebody starts pursuing someone, they feel anxious. They don't feel heard. They don't feel like their needs are going to be met or their problem is going to be resolved. So they might get a little more critical in their pursuit because they're trying to get their partner's attention. And in doing that, it further damages and makes the situation more toxic and is not
Mhm.
effective in any sort of way. So you don't want to be punitive, and you don't want to shut down all conversations. You
All
want
the
to see if you
time.
can, there should be, you want to work towards, having enough distress tolerance and enough coping skills where you can stay in a difficult conversation. And that actually, if you're noticing that it's really hard for you to do that you want to retreat immediately, that's a good time to consider engaging in therapy, whether it's couples therapy or even in your own individual therapy, to understand why your nervous system is not allowing you to engage in conflict with your partner that maybe isn't life threatening, that you're experiencing it as a threat that is not aligned with what is actually happening.
Mhm. Mhm. Laura, I'm curious for you, how often do you see this dynamic? So again, if we're using the example of running late. So if I run late today, it's because, there was traffic, my boss asked me to work overtime, the kids were, the soccer game ran over. There's always a reason, right? There is uh, there's evidence, I guess, for lack of a better word, or an excuse, right? My reason for lateness is excusable, but when you do it, it's about your personality, right? You're doing this to hurt me, it hurts me. So how often do you see that come up? It's okay when I do it, but when you do it, right, this is your character, this is your personality.
Well, what I see that happen, and what I see happening in those things, is the person is feeling very hurt by something that might not even be related to what is happening.
Mm-hmm.
And so they might be responding to a childhood trauma. They might be responding to maybe something that happened earlier in the relationship. And they're so they're having an irrational and illogical response to what is happening, because what's coming up for them is actually not the thing that pushes the button. So you showing up late pushes the button of when my parents didn't pick me up from school and I was left by myself there. So there could
Yeah.
be different things going on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. So if we really get into what's really abusive and toxic. So obviously the things we've talked about, especially the contempt, is not good. Often there is ill intent in that behavior, but overall, toxic, abusive conflict is very damaging, and it's essentially pouring poison onto your relationship. And these are more extreme things like physical, emotional abuse, throwing things, lots of insults, mocking, ridiculing, competing, right, for perspectives. This is for me to win, but in a very extreme way. Again, we talked about gaslighting last week, and really dominant personality traits like stubbornness and competitiveness, again, where, you're just really flexing that muscle to really harm your partner. So you feel like this sense of winning the disagreement.
And fighting to win is so destructive because you're not winning anything. You're damaging your relationship. And maybe you really most likely have not changed your partner's mind or perspective. You've just shut them down. And so they actually don't even agree with you. And there's just damage being done to the relationship. So there is no winning. There's only like meeting in the middle, each person feeling validated, seeing the problem as being addressed, not taking each other down. So I just remind couples of that. When you win an argument, when you know, whatever that means to you, you probably haven't won anything. In fact, you've created more conflict that's going to need to be addressed in the future.
Yeah. Yeah. Every time you win, quote unquote, you're losing, the relationship is losing, and having to think of it in that way. And if we take responsibility, if we apologize, a lot of times people have this thought of, well, if I do that, if I apologize to my partner, then I lost, versus no, what you're doing is you're showing that you value the relationship overall. You know what, you're right. I am sorry. You know, I can realize why that may have hurt your feelings. I shouldn't have raised my voice, versus again, that digging your heels in behavior and then almost becoming cruel doesn't do any favors for the relationship.
No, absolutely not. So we've got a few tips here for having healthy conflict for people to take with them today as they go into interactions with their partners. And so first of all, we have validate each other's perspectives. So Michelle, what are some pro tips for being sure that you're validating your partner's perspective, even when you don't agree with them? What are some things people could do?
Yeah, validating again can look like, oh, okay, that's I can see why you view it that way based on, you know, your experience of the situation, or, you know, I don't quite understand. Can you help me understand more? And how can I show up for you and support you in this? Things like that, where you're leaning into what your partner is saying, can be so validating and so helpful.
Yeah. And even if you don't agree at all, saying things like, I hear that was a really hard experience for you. I hear that my behavior made you feel bad, you know, and acknowledging that instead of saying, you shouldn't have felt bad, I didn't mean it, is so much more powerful. You're going to de-escalate the situation versus just pouring gasoline on the fire.
Yeah, that famous, well, just calm down. It's not that bad. Well,
yeah.
If it is to me, guess what? It's real bad. And you just made it 10 times worse by telling me it wasn't. So that backfired on you. One thing too is a lot of times couples come into couples therapy, I think, and hopefully to eliminate all fighting or conflict altogether. Again, a lot of times there's going to be a higher percentage of things that you can't move past, that aren't workable or solvable problems. So there's never have the expectation of we need to stop fighting altogether. Do we need to relearn some of these destructive ways of doing it? Yes, but you're always going to disagree. Well, not always, hopefully, right? But there's always going to be disagreements throughout the course of your relationship. And
always
that's okay.
So Michelle, we are already out of time for today.
Yes.
Thank you so much for listening and tuning in. And we will be back next week with more on Holding Ground. Have a great week. Thanks for tuning in to Holding Ground. You can hear us here every Tuesday morning at 9:30 a.m. on KKNW. I'm Laura Richer at Anchor Light Therapy Collective.
Find us online at anchorlighttherapy.com.
And we'll see you next week.